Hi, this is Tom Field, Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Targeted Attacks, 6 Keys for Fighting Back. Your featured presenters today are Bob Corsten, Director of Solutions Marketing with Trend Micro, and Patrick Hill, the Senior Product Line Manager for HP Enterprise Security Products. Now, before I turn this over to Bob and to Patrick, I want to give you just a bit of background on today's session. Target, Sony, Anthem, the biggest recent breaches have taught us all big lessons, namely that traditional security solutions are ineffective against advanced threats. And today's targeted attacks not only can rob your organization of sensitive data, customers' reputation, they can also cost senior leaders their jobs. In this session today, you're going to learn the 6 keys to success in fighting advanced threats. You'll hear firsthand from our security leaders at HP and Trend Micro how to monitor all attack phases, how to mine the security gaps, and how to defeat anti-evasion features, and much more. I'll take a moment now to tell you a bit about Information Security Media Group. We currently publish more than 24 international media sites. We have Bank Info Security and CU Info Security for financial services, Gov Info Security for the public sector, and Healthcare Info Security for the medical community. We also publish Info Risk Today about information risk management, Data Breach Today about breach prevention and response, and Careers Info Security. Each of these sites is dedicated to providing education and news regarding information security, but specifically tailored to their individual sectors. With over 550,000 members registered to our sites, we've created a true information source that tackles the key issues of interest to our unique audience. Next, I want to give you just a few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions for Bob or Patrick during the course of this session, please submit them via the chat window that you see on your screen. If any of you should experience technical issues while viewing today's webinar, please dial the number on your screen. If you dial extension 115, we do have technical support staff standing by to help. Also, I do need to emphasize, the content being presented in today's webinar is copyrighted material. It's meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you or your organization would like to use the information presented in today's session or are looking for customized training education, please contact us. Let's take a moment now to meet our sponsors. HP is a leading provider of security intelligence and compliance solutions for enterprises that want to mitigate risk and defend against today's most advanced threats. Based on market-leading products from ArcSight, Fatala, Fortify, and Tipping Point, HP Enterprise Security Products enables organizations to take a proactive approach to security, integrating information correlation, application analysis, and network-level defense. HP Security Research strengthens this portfolio of solutions through innovative research, delivering actionable security intelligence while providing insight into the future of security and the most critical threats facing organizations today. To learn more about HP Enterprise Security Products, please visit www.hpenterprisesecurity.com. As a global leader in IT security, Trend Micro develops innovative security solutions that make the world safe for businesses and consumers to exchange digital information. With over a quarter century of security expertise, Trend Micro is recognized as the market leader in server security, cloud security, and small business content security. Trend Micro Security fits the needs of customers and partners. Their solutions protect end users on any device, optimize security for the modern data center, and secure networks against breaches from targeted attacks. They deliver top-ranked client-server, network, and cloud-based protection that stops new threats faster, detects breaches better, and protects data in physical, virtual, and cloud environments. And now let's meet our speakers. Up first, you're going to hear from Bob Corsten. He's the Director of Solutions Marketing for Trend Micro. His focus is to help enterprises identify and address the growing strategic problem of targeted attacks and advanced threats, You should know that Bob is an experienced speaker, having provided seminars, industry briefings, and strategic guidance on enterprise technology around the globe. You'll also be hearing from Patrick Hill. He's Senior Product Line Manager for HP Enterprise Security Products, where he's responsible for product strategy for HP DV Labs, a recognized leader in vulnerability research and security intelligence. Patrick's experience spans over 20 years in information technology. With that, let me turn this over now to Patrick and to Bob. Gentlemen?
Thanks, Tom. So to start off, what we'd like to do is provide a bit of an overview on targeted attacks, specifically scope what the problem is, talk about what the impact is, and then Patrick will come in and share with you some perspective on 6 keys to successfully addressing the problem. So with that, let's move along to the next slide. So what you're looking at here is a bit of an analogy, and as you can see, there's a picture of a castle, some secured walls, and a cannon. So naturally, you may ask, well, what does this have to do with targeted attacks? Well, the analogy I'd like to present to you is that similar to the castle in medieval times, current organizations have spent a lot of time, money, and effort in setting up their firewalls, their gateways, their endpoint security, as well as all of their processes related to that. And that develops a sense of security. But just like in medieval times when castles and hardened fortifications were built, some means and methods come along to bypass those, namely the cannon. The cannon comes along, I can shoot down the walls, through the castle, over the walls. In other words, that fortification then would need to be enhanced in order to defend against this new type of attack. The exact same logic applies as far as targeted attacks are concerned today. And that where these investments in firewalls, IPSs, et cetera, have been put in place, not to at all suggest that they are no longer needed. Clearly, they have a role to play. But what needs to be done is to then enhance those security capabilities to address the problem of target attacks, or in other words, the cannon. So the key thing is to really understand that the world has shifted. It's not that there's anything wrong with the investments that have been made in security, but just like the typical cat and mouse game we see in other areas of society, the same thing is applying as it relates to targeted attacks. So moving on to the next slide, then I think what is important to share is the context around what is driving attackers to then breach networks and to conduct these attacks. So as you'll see in the next slide, following the analogy around medieval times, it's really all about the data. And in advancing the animation, you can see that it's about the attackers getting to those crown jewels, if you will. So the security threat here has a major business or organizational continuity impact in terms of the attackers wanting to get customer records, supply chain data, intellectual property, or communications that they want to extract out of the network and then monetize. So this is what's driving the behavior. This is what has led to the situation where existing security investments can then be flanked or evaded, if you will. It's because organizations have made such a large investment in automating and turning processes into electronic record storage, et cetera, that because it now resides electronically, it can therefore be stolen electronically. So that's an important point to keep in mind as to what is motivating the attackers and why this has happened. So moving on to the next slide, the next piece of context that we'd like to share is, as we heard at the outset, there's been some pretty prolific attacks that have been in the news, and I just happen to pick 2 here, that being Sony and Target. And as much as the individual news clippings tell an interesting story into themselves, what I would recommend focusing on are the impacts that happened out of the attack. For example, in the case of Sony, unfortunately this was the second time that they had been breached. But what is telling to me in the case of Sony is if you look at kind of what was happening at Sony at the time, and that is they had invested tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars in a product, call that the movie, The Interview, and they were getting ready to release that, and it had all of their business plans, strategy, marketing plans, etc., that were completely usurped as a result of a targeted attack. And this is, as we know, it's had damages on Sony's brand, on their business operations, on the timing of their product launch. So this is but one example of the types of ancillary impacts that result from a targeted attack. It's not just that the network's been breached, the data has been removed, but it's those unexpected impacts of the attack that play out here. The same thing applies in the case of Target. So some of those unexpected impacts were resignation of two senior executives within the company, the fact that they're, the last I had heard in the news, dealing with $148 million in unexpected costs. So nowhere are you going to find on most companies' balance sheets or income statements an allocation for tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in spending to deal with a targeted attack. And the point matter being, yes, there's a lot of data points around the targeted attack, but in this particular case, because of the large dollar value, you have to think about the conversations that are taking or have taken place within Target. Okay, now how much money do we need to spend? Where is that money going to come from, given that we had plans on what we wanted to do with those funds in terms of investments, dividends, store expansion, whatever their plans were, and as a result, all of that now had to be recalibrated as a result of this attack. So again, the security aspect of the impacts of the attacks is interesting, but it's those ancillary, unanticipated impacts are what really what should be drawing our attention around why this is such a serious issue that requires your attention. So moving on to the next slide, the next thing what I would like to share with you is just, again, some additional context on why we're here. And what you're looking at is just a very simplistic chart that shows a level of sophistication on the y-axis and then time on the x. And the point of the matter here is that as you've seen the type of hacker or attacker behavior, how it's evolved, what you've gone from is a model where it's kind of mass production. So, if I may use a military analogy, I may, build out hand grenades or bombs I can drop out of an airplane or something else that can be used anywhere, to the point where I'm now, if you will, becoming more of a sniper in terms of I have this specific weapon that I'm custom building for a specific target that I'm going after, and I'm spending far more time in researching the target and developing means and methods on how I can exploit and get to that target, and then building out my payload and my whole attack process to deal exactly with that. So the level of effort that's required by these attackers has gone up, the level of sophistication has gone up, and as a result, how we approach security needs to change as well. Because on the left-hand side of the chart, you have attack patterns that, in general terms, are predictable. I know what their behaviors are, how they're delivered, so therefore, if I can recognize an aspect of that attack pattern, I can then take a known action to stop it. Whereas on the right-hand side, in the case of targeted attacks and advanced threats, I may have never seen it before. I don't know how they're coming at me, what they're doing, where they're going, what their objectives are, yet what this means is that from a security perspective, I have to completely change my approach. I have to be able to detect what previously was undetectable, and I have to then be able to take fast and flexible action to limit or stop the attack based on a large number of unknowns. So it's an entirely different model. But again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not the be-all and end-all. I still need to have my security infrastructure and multiple layers of defense to deal with all these, because if I don't, then you know what the attackers are going to do, and it's just going to have other impacts associated with it. So moving on to the next chart, so since we've looked at the impacts from a business perspective, why attackers do what they do, what this means to organizations as they are attacked, and why this is happening from a technical perspective, let's have an outside view on why this matters. And there's some interesting data points here. For example, recently the World Economic Forum listed cyber attacks as one of their top 5 global risks. The Institute of Internal Auditors have stated that 86% of boards of directors are not actively involved in cybersecurity preparedness. Well, so what? Why does this matter? Well, if you go back to the example that we talked about earlier with Sony and with Target, you've got major business impacts that are happening. And we all know the role of boards of directors. They have a fiduciary responsibility of a number of things, but one of them is to make sure that there are practices and processes in place to protect the assets, the revenue streams, and the general operations of the organizations that they represent. Yet, given that a large percentage of them are not actively involved, and I'm not faulting anybody, it's just a state of nature, this really speaks to how we need to socialize the problem and come to grips with it, especially in the case of, as an example, Target, where some of their boards of directors were subject to potential lawsuits as a result of that attack. If you then move down to the bottom left corner, there was some research that was done by PwC in conjunction with Ponymon and others, where shows in the case of large enterprises that the average cost of an attack is $5.9 million. Now, just in the Target example alone, we've seen more than 10 times that amount. Other examples are the EMC or the RSA breach. That came in just north of $60 million. So the point of the matter is that from a pure finance perspective, it's a meaningful dollar amount that requires a far different type of discussion and priority given everything that we've heard. Now, the last piece I'd like to share with you is some research that at Trend Micro we commissioned with the folks at Harvard Business Review, where we had a look and did some surveying with many of your peers to help understand some context around how they perceive the targeted attack problem and what some of their actions are. And there's an interesting, if you will, kind of dichotomy that was observed, where 60% of those in IT security type roles were concerned about the targeted attack problem and viewed that there was a matter of time before their networks were breached. Yet 70% of the senior decision makers felt that they were not well informed of what the risks and the potential impacts are. So again, the reason why I'm sharing this is I hope you find that this is all related to the context behind the problem. It's not just a security issue. There's a broader business and organizational impact, yet there's also a bit of inconsistency in terms of an understanding of the problem from a security perspective and the potential impacts from a business point of view. So next slide, please. So from here, just like to share a couple other points, and then we'll move it over to Patrick. So the last piece is understanding from an attacker's and an organization's perspective how this can happen. And really, if you start to kind of balance out the characteristics of both, it's more than reasonable to conclude that attackers have an unfair advantage, meaning that they have the ability to access all of the weapons and expertise that they want. There's online forums, services that they can hire, expertise that they can get at a click of a mouse to provide guidance on how to execute an attack, or even if they're in the middle of attack, how to go about it. There are very low barriers to entry. All you need is access to the internet, a mouse and a credit card, and you can get pretty much anything that you need to launch a targeted attack. In their case, their objectives are very focused. They're going to pick the targets that they're going to go after, and if in the event that they may be caught, there's a low penalty for failure, because in many cases, these attacks are launched from overseas countries, or they're launched where they'll island hop into somebody's network and get to someone else, and it's very difficult to establish direct attribution in terms of those specific individuals that executed an attack, let alone the ability to then bring them to justice, although there's been many examples where that has been the case. Now, from an organization or a target perspective, they're dealing with resource constraints. I'm sure you all know about the amount of information in terms of incidents and security issues that arise on any given day. So how is it that you're going to be able to zero in on targeted attacks given all of those things that you need to deal with, let alone all the other initiatives and projects that are underway? Furthermore, organizations have multiple points of defense. It's not as if they just have to worry about their front door. They need to worry about the front door, all the windows, the roof, the basement, the garages, every single point of entry, if you will, in and out of their network, where all the attackers need to do is decide where they want to go in and figure out how they're going to go in there and not get caught. But the other thing to keep in mind is a bit of a counterbalance is that organizations have a very high penalty for failure. We've seen in the case of Target where it had an impact on people's careers. Furthermore, it may have impact on their professional standing within the organization where an attack happens on their watch. And the high penalty as well, obviously, is all the organizational impacts that may result that we touched on earlier. So with that, let's move along to the next chart. So I touched on this earlier where I hinted at, looking at what a credit card and a mouse can buy, but just to put some context around this, this is based on some research that was done by the folks at Trend Labs. And you can see, just assuming it's happened over a month, your upfront costs are right around the $600 mark. And again, all you need is a credit card and a mouse, and all of these things are available online. I can get a VPN service so that it's easy for me to run some encrypted traffic and not be caught. I can get a botnet framework to launch my attack. I can have hosting for it, exploit kits, domain names, all the different tools, techniques, and services that are needed. So in other words, the problem is going to get worse before it gets better because, as I mentioned earlier, the barriers to entry are low. Anybody can do it. For example, in the case of the black POS malware that was used in Target and Home Depot, some of the speculation that had been discussed is that software was developed by a young kid. And nothing against his programming skills, but I think that speaks to just how prolific the problem can be, given that teenagers are able to build attack code and then sell it. So moving on to the next chart, please. So in conclusion, it's very important to understand, and especially as you start to go through the animation in this slide, that attackers want to get into your network, not get caught, get the data, and then get out. And they are going to use every entry point and means and method to do so. So despite the fact that it may be kind of, sexy or interesting to hear about attacks that are happening over HTTP or email, that is just but the tip of the iceberg in terms of how attackers design their breaches into networks. And so what they're going to do is they're going to figure out a way to get in. They may not even come in from the outside. They may have a very easy way of coming in and starting their attack from within. So, for example, maybe they decide that the best way to get into your network is they see that a bunch of your employees happen to spend some time at a coffee shop not far from one of your main offices. They breach that wireless network, use that wireless network to get into some devices or laptops from your employees. The employee unknowingly walks that laptop into your organization. Boom, the attacker's in. That's just but one example. So the point of the matter is, you need to be able to be agnostic and diagnose all and monitor all network traffic in and out of your network. Same thing applies as far as protocols and applications are concerned. It's not just about HTTP traffic. It's about FTP. It's about SMB. It's about database protocols. Wherever you are not monitoring, that is where the attackers are going to go. Why? Because they don't want to get caught. Why do they not want to get caught? Because they want to get your data, intellectual property, monetize it, and get paid. Same logic applies for network ports. You have to be able to monitor all of the 65,000 and growing network ports within your network. If you don't, the attackers are just going to use that as an unmonitored hallway, if you will, and then launch and execute their attack from those ports where you're not monitoring. The other thing to keep in mind is you also want to be able to identify known threats. For example, as we stated, in the case of Target, they use known malware to execute that attack. So the point of the matter is it's not just about the unknown, the 0 days, the exploits, as important as that is. You also want the ability to recognize known attributes of an attack. Maybe it's malware that was seen before. What if it's a known IP address? What if it's a known bad URL? All of these type known bad files. All these types of things you want to be able to readily identify and triage so that you can quickly determine where the attack problem is coming from. And then, as I touched on, unknown threats, the 0-day exploits, the command and control that you've never seen before, the evolving nature of the attacks, all of these attributes there where it's about detecting what before you would not detect. All very, very important. And then last but by no means least, attacks are dynamic in nature. They're not static. I don't use the same command and control. We've got some research that shows in many cases command and control, a large percentage of it lasts less than a day. So the IP addresses are changing, the nature and manner of the command and control changes, let alone the structure of the attack, where it's coming from, where it's going to. In other words, you need to be able to dynamically monitor all of this. So with that, let's move on to the next chart. So what goes on in the wild, I think, is very important, and this just speaks to what we just viewed earlier. So if you look at, for example, this sample for poison ivy malware, you can see that it, over its life, has used multiple ports. So the point of the matter being, if you're only looking at port 80, well, you can see that in this case of poison ivy malware, it can use all kinds of different ports. And if I'm only looking at one, I'm going to miss all the others. So this speaks to why you need to have the ability to monitor all network ports. Same thing applies if you look at the EvilGrab malware sample. That in this particular case, it used 9 different protocols. So if I can only, or I'm only monitoring, for example, web and email, I'm going to be blind to all the other activity on the other protocols. Same logic applies when we look at the last malware sample, where the command and control, the IP addresses, the attack code, the behavior all changes over time. So the takeaways here, these are just but some examples of why you need to be able to have agnostic monitoring of all kinds of activity that is happening on your network. Using an analogy, if you're just looking at your front door, then all you're going to know about are the attacks that come in the front door, not what's coming in the window, the chimney, the basement, the garage, etc. So it's all about establishing very wide and broad visibility to attack behavior within your network. So moving on to the next one. So lastly, the important thing is this shows that traditional defenses need your help. What you're looking at is a sample of results from proof of concepts that have been conducted. And you can see these are customers and organizations just like yours where 98% of them were finding advanced malware. So the point is these are organizations that have their next-gen firewalls, have their IPSs, have their gateways, have their endpoints, and attackers are finding ways to get the malware around those security layers and into the network. Active botnets, disruptive applications, malicious documents. But I think the other thing to keep in mind here is you can also see that zero-day malware is showing up in almost 50% of the cases. Now, there's some interesting things to keep in mind here. As sexy and interesting as zero-day malware is, it's not all about those zero-day malwares, and here's why. To use zero-day malwares takes a lot more effort, time, and money by attackers. They need to find the exploits, in some cases pay for them, and use them. Now, attackers are human beings like the rest of us. They're going to take the path of least resistance and the fastest way to get to what they want. And as you can see, advanced malware, in many cases, is exactly that. It's easier, faster, cheaper for them. Now, depending on the nature of the attack, what the objectives are, there may be a case for them to exploit a zero-day malware, but the point of the matter is it's not everything. It's a part of and a very important part of the picture. So moving along. The conclusions, networks are being breached, and there's a lot that's happening in terms of those impacts. So wrapping up finally, what are the impacts of targeted attacks? Just viewing the animation, they are unexpected risks, unexpected costs, strategic impacts, as well as potential impacts on your career. So the next chart, please. So wrapping all these up, let's have a look at what happened at Target. They experienced a data breach of 110 million records. They are now dealing with over 80 civil lawsuits that resulted. At the time, they lost over $4 billion in market value. Their CEO resigned. Their CIO resigned. Their costs were estimated to be exceedingly high. Their profits fell, and 7 board members are at risk. So this speaks to the fact that A, the impacts of target attacks can be very unexpected, but B, very far-reaching in terms of the potential impacts on the business or the organization. Moving to the next slide. So now I'd like to pass it over to Patrick to share his thoughts and insight with regards to targeted attacks.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. So I thought it'd be good to give a background on what an advanced target attack looks like, and then talk about the ways that new solutions are becoming available and what to look for as you're evaluating those new solutions. If we take a look at an advanced target attack, they're called advanced because they have multiple phases. It's not a simple drive-by, execute a virus, and melt your hard drive. It's actually multiple phases wrapped together to achieve a purpose. So the first phase is intelligence gathering. This is where the adversary, the attacker, will look at external websites, LinkedIn pages, even Twitter and Facebook to find out who they want to target within the organization. They can be looking for titles, email addresses, links between different individuals to figure out a way, the best method for entry into that organization. So once they've done their intelligence gathering, they come up with a plan for the point of entry. This is where they actually do the break-in. This is where most solutions are focused today, particularly the traditional security stack. Point of entry could be web-based. It could be a spear phishing attack via email, but also it could be using a thumb drive that's placed at on a physical location. It could be through a laptop that's at a conference in a hotel. There's multiple different ways that the point of entry can take place. Once the attacker is gained entry into the organization, it's typically done with a very small payload that exploits a vulnerability in an application, a web browser, etc. So once it has a footprint within the organization, the next step is to reach back out to the command and control server, which is based in the internet, and then to pull down the actual payload that's going to carry out the rest of the attack. That payload will then have instructions for what to do next, and typically that involves lateral movement within the organization. So they don't know where you may have gotten into some point in the organization that doesn't have particularly interesting access, so then they want to escalate that access privileges, administrative control, try to move within the network to get into the data center, get closer to key assets such as databases, web servers, etc. Once they've made that lateral movement, gotten into the data center and databases, then they start to collect the data that's of interest to them. This might be usernames and passwords, it could be credit card data, personal information, PII. It could also be intellectual property, which is more and more valuable in terms of designs, plans, acquisitions, pricing, all kinds of data that can give competitors an edge up. Once they've collected the data, the next task is to get it out of the organization, and this is the ultimate success factor for the attack. So if you can thwart the attack anywhere within the different phases, you will successfully prevent it from succeeding. But once it starts to exfiltrate data, then the game's over. The exploitation process, typically they'll stage the data on a server within the organization, chop it up into small bits, encrypt it, and then slowly move it out of the network so that it's not easily detectable. You know, if you see hundreds of megabytes or gigabytes going to an unknown location, that's probably easy to detect. But if you see small, 10, 100K files moving periodically, that can easily fly under the radar. So I wanted to talk about the traditional security stack and sort of what the pros and cons are. If you think about it as a funnel, at any given point in time, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of attacks taking place in a typical organization. And as those attacks come through the network stack, security stack, different tools are used for different types of attacks, and they have their specific purposes and their strong points and weak points. If you take a look at the next-gen firewall, it's basically a control point more than a security device. It's giving you policy control over what ports and IP addresses are open. If it's next-gen firewall, then you can control applications. So if you don't want Facebook in your organization, you can turn that off. So it gives you some control, but it doesn't necessarily have security functionality. The next on the stack is the IPS, Intrusion Prevention System. This is a critical component that is able to block inline, real-time exploit attempts against network-based vulnerabilities. Very good at that particular function. Then you have web gateways. Again, it's more of a policy device that allows you to block access to certain websites that aren't allowed from your organization. Email gateways, great for blocking spam, some of the more basic email attacks. And then antivirus, down at the endpoint level, good at preventing known viruses from getting into the network. But even though the stack is able to reduce the number of attacks and the funnel gets narrower and narrower, there's still things getting through. And This is very evident by the things that Bob went over in terms of the number of successful attacks. The data from proof of concepts where we're going to organizations, and over 90% have been breached. So although these are all critical components and are necessary, and you're encouraged to go after best of breed for each of these, they're just not enough. You need to add another layer to the stack. So the industry is aware of this, right? And it's become a new market segment, if you will. Analysts are starting to cover it. There's a number of new entrants into the space. IDGE calls it specialized threat analysis and protection. Gartner has done multiple reports, one entitled malware protection systems and others advanced threat detection. An organization called NSS Labs recently did a bake-off, if you will, among several competing products called breach detection systems. So again, the industry is very aware that this is a problem. There are new solutions out on the market. It becomes a little bit gray. You see all the different names. It's not a very well-established space, and it's not always clear what you should be looking for. And I hope to kind of provide some guidance around that today. So I'll start by talking about what an advanced protection solution looks like. And again, there are multiple different ways that the products out there are coming about it, but I'll kind of talk about it generally, what these solutions do. You know, the first thing they're good at is detecting suspicious files that are crossing the network. So they're looking for certain flags. If it's an unknown file, if it's you know, a JPEG extension but it has exe executable code in it, things like that, that would trigger it as being suspicious, or perhaps where it came from. Once it identifies a suspicious file, the next step would be to execute the file within a sandbox environment. And a sandbox is a virtual, it could be a Windows environment where it can execute the suspicious file and detect what behavior it executes in that sandbox without actually affecting real endpoints on your network. So the types of detection or behaviors that the solutions are looking for is it updating registry keys? Is it dropping additional files? Is it modifying existing files? Is it changing the footprint of programs that are running in memory? Is it reaching out, talking to external hosts, and control servers, if you will? So none of these indicators are mapped, and then based on what they do, determination can be made whether it's a malicious file or not. The next thing is, once that determination has been made, you can take the feedback from the command and control accesses, the files that it's updating, etc., and feed that back to basically a global network, right? So you want to be able to take that and share it with other devices that are on the network so that they can enforce and look out for these attacker activities. And then finally, the solutions should be looking for and monitoring the network for infected hosts. There are multiple entry points and ways for endpoints to get infected. But once they're infected, you need to be able to detect those and quickly mitigate them and get them off the network and to block any activity that they may be doing. So this is kind of a general overview of what advanced threat protection looks like today. So next I'm going to talk about what some of the keys to success are. Hopefully, just based on all the facts and the figures and the news that Bob talked about before, every information security professional should be looking at these advanced threat solutions and come up with a strategy. Probably as part of that process. If not, you're probably getting ready to start it. So what are the things that you should be looking for? So number one, monitor all attack phases. As I mentioned, there's 6 distinct phases within a typical advanced attack. The point of entry, this is the one that most solutions focus on. this is, the sitting behind the firewall, watching files come in and out, and it's very important to be able to control that. But command and control, also another important point that needs to be watched. Very difficult as well because host names are constantly changing, IP addresses, protocols that the adversaries are using to make that command and control communication. And then there's the lateral movement, data collection, exfiltration. These are oftentimes overlooked by the solutions that are out in the market today. So you want to look at all phases of the attack, not just the point of entry, because there are many points of entry in today's networks. It's not just coming in through the firewall. It could be coming in through a laptop that's been at home, from a commuter. It could be coming in through a thumb drive. It could be coming in through a hotel. So there's many different points of entry, and you need to make sure that you're covering all of these attack vectors no matter what point of entry was used. Next is mind the gaps. And again, Bob pointed out that today's sophisticated adversary is not simply coming in through HTTP port 80. Yes, there are many attacks coming in through that vector, and it needs to be monitored and controlled, but that's only catching part of the funnel. So the more sophisticated attackers are going to look for web servers that are running on non-standard ports, maybe something in a R&D lab or some authorized server within an organization. They'll also be looking at maybe there's file shares or FTP servers that are exposed the organization doesn't even know about. So advanced attackers can be looking at all the ports and all the different protocols, trying to find an entry into the organization. So next we'll talk about lateral movement. As Bob mentioned, you watch the front door and the different points of entry, and you try to block as much as you can there. But once it gets into your organization, because you can't stop everything, and the perimeter is not crisp and clean anymore, it can come in from the laptop and USB drive, etc. There's still points within the attack vector where you can stop it from being a successful attack, and that's lateral movement, one of those key points. So within the lateral movement, you're using different protocols. It's not going to use HTTP anymore. Now it's using database protocols or SMB to look at file shares with an organization. It's trying to log into domain servers, things like that. So it's important to make sure that your solution is monitoring not just the north-south, which is coming through the firewall, but the east-west traffic, which is the lateral traffic within your organization. Anti-evasion is very important. This is a cat and mouse game. It's constantly changing and evolving. And so, yeah, the attackers know that there's advanced solutions out there, and so now they're coming up with ways to try to evade. Here's just a couple of ways that are being used. Compress files. So taking a executable, putting it inside of a zip, inside of a RAR, inside of a tar file, so that it might bypass some of the traditional security measures because it no longer looks like it started out. So can this solution extract those files and get to the root malware that's embedded in them? Password protect archive is another technique that makes it difficult to analyze a file that's coming across the network. Is the solution able to use commonly known passwords to try to crack that open and execute it within a sandbox to make a determination of whether it's malicious or not? Anti-sandbox evasion. Again, hackers are getting more savvy, so they know there's sandboxes running out there, and they'll check to see is it a known VM image? Is there, can you use time delays to try to avoid, if the sandbox is simply executing for 30 seconds and then moving on, all it has to do is wait for an hour before it launches its attack, and the sandbox won't be aware of it. There's many other techniques that attackers use, such as looking for user input, right, to try to determine the difference between an automated sandbox and a real-life machine. And if it thinks it's running a sandbox, it'll simply go dormant, won't be detected, and will go through the network. So it's important to look at the anti-evasion sandbox evasions that are available in whatever solution you're evaluating. Speaking of the custom sandboxes, or the evasion, custom sandbox is one of the key components of that. But there's other advantages to using custom sandboxes. And what I mean by a custom sandbox is being able to take your corporate image, whatever you run in your organization. It can be Windows 8, 32-bit, but also what applications. Are you running Adobe 11? You have SAP, different applications in your environment, creating a unique image that matches what your typical desktop in your environment would have, and putting that in the sandbox. And the advantages of doing this is that it'll detect attacks that are targeted just at your organization. For example, if an attacker is targeting an organization that is, out of France, they may look to make sure that the user is running a French keyboard or is installed in French language. And that would be a very quick way to determine whether that organization or if infiltrated is the one that they're trying to attack. They may also be attacking specific applications that you run in your environment. And if you don't have those running in your sandbox, they won't be detected as a potential vector for entry. The second thing is to identify attacks that don't impact your environment. So if you're running Windows 7, 32-bit, and there's an attack that is designed for Windows XP, you're not going to be as concerned about it, right? So you want to see the patch level, the versions, the applications in your environment. How's that attack going to behave within your environment? And that'll give you an indication of how concerned you should be about it. If you're already patched, so the attack executes, but it fails, you know that it's not something that you need to necessarily worry about. You can monitor it, but it shouldn't affect your organization because you are running versions that aren't susceptible to that vulnerability. And then the third one is getting back to the point about evasions. So a number of solutions to run generic sandboxes. So they'll have a standard image, Windows image, that ships with their products. And, of course, the adversaries are aware of this, and so they're able to look for certain indicators of that image, of that Windows instance. It's probably going to be set up for the English language or the English keyboard. It may have a specific Windows serial number. It may have certain register keys that are set. So these are key indicators that the malware can look for in the execution environment. It detects that it's running in a sandbox, and it goes dormant. You don't want that to happen. You want to see it execute so that you can make a determination of it. There are numerous examples, when you run side by side of, targeted attacks, being able to bypass certain solutions that are detected by other solutions. So very important to look at. And then the last thing is independent test results. Currently, Intercessor Labs is the only independent study I'm aware of that has looked at breach detection systems and their efficacy of detecting attacks, as well as evasions and false positives. So if you look at the chart, the things they looked at were HTTP malware attacks. They looked at email-based attacks, a number of different exploit vectors, make sure the solution is stable and reliable. They looked at evasions, again, how easy was it to bypass the security measures, and false positives. And false positives are just going to take away time from being able to investigate the true attacks on the organization. So look for results of independent tests, and I'll give you a good kind of benchmark or starting point to see what solutions are in the ranges that you're looking for your organization. To give a plug for the HP Trend solution in the NSS Labs report, the solution was the top score in terms of security effectiveness, as well as the total cost of ownership. And with that, that wraps up the solutions slides. And if you want to learn more about particular products available from HP, there's a website you can go to. I also have my email address as well as Bob's. Feel free to reach out to us directly if you have any questions or comments. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Tom.
Hey, Patrick, thanks so much. I appreciate your insight and Bob's as well. It was a great presentation, and we've got the opportunity now to take some questions from the audience. So I want to remind attendees, if you have questions for Patrick or Bob, submit them now via the chat window on your screen. I'm sure we won't have time to get to every question, but for those that we can't answer today, I promise we will get responses back to you via email. So guys, we've got some questions that have come through here, and I've come up with some myself, so I'm going to throw these out here and hope that we can have a bit of an interactive dialogue here, so feel free to jump in. First question is, and I know both of you covered this extensively, we all know what the biggest recent breaches have been. Bob, you had them up on your screen, Target, Sony. But what have been the biggest game-changing impacts of those breaches?
Well, I'll take a stab at that one, Tom. I think the biggest thing is we can't, nobody can hide from it anymore, right? You can't complete ignorance that, that was a big surprise. A couple of years ago that may have been the case, but now it's in the boardroom, it's at the CEO level. This is a problem that has to be addressed within our organization. It's not something that we can kind of hope it doesn't happen to us.
And if I may add, I think in addition to what Patrick had mentioned, it's kind of exposing the extent of the problem in terms of the potential business impacts that can happen. I mean, you saw in the case of, for example, Target, $148 million that's just chopped right out of their operations and their bottom line that could have been used for job creation, all kinds of other impacts. So I think there's a festering wound from an organizational standpoint, but as you saw in some of the higher level, for example, the World Economic Forum and others, there is also a larger economic impact as far as economies, growth, et cetera, are concerned.
Bob, I want to toss this next question to you, and Patrick, perhaps you can offer some commentary as well. The question is, what are the attack trends that concern you the most right now?
There's a couple of things. I go back to that one slide where I mentioned kind of offhand, all you need is a credit card and a mouse. That whole perspective on attacks is what concerns me, is that anybody can do it, and the motivations may be different. Maybe somebody that had a bad experience with a product and for some reason decides to conduct that kind of thing, to anybody, including if you have an unethical competitor, if there are certain nation states or competitors within those nation states that decide that they want to get into a market and you've got something that's unique. It's just the scope of the problem. I think it's, using the analogy I did earlier, it's similar to the iceberg. We've just seen the tip. I think the problem is going to be, and will be far more bigger in terms of impact, and we're going to see this, quite frankly, I think, just over the next few months in 2015, where there's going to be more attacks, and their impact will be even bigger than what we've seen to date.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is, my concern is how rapidly new advanced threat techniques are spread throughout the black hat community. So a new obfuscation is discovered, and it quickly becomes available to anybody to use. So it's not just a highly funded organization that can use it. Anybody can use it now.
Patrick, I want to toss this next question to you first, and Bob, I'd love your input as well. We spent a fair amount of time talking about what's wrong with traditional security controls, but what's wrong with traditional security skills, and where do organizations need to bolster those to be able to respond to advanced threats?
Yeah, that's a good point. It is a bit of a different skill set, and you have to kind of get into the mind of the attacker much more than you would in the past. Before is much more of a control, right? Control what gets into your organization and who can do what. But now you have to think much more like a bad guy. How would they get into your organization? What would they do to breach your systems, and set up scenarios to attack those? at this point, I think the best way to gather those skills is working with peer groups. There's a number of organizations, ISSA, C-squared, et cetera, that will allow you to interact with peers and learn how they're adapting to the new threat environment.
Yeah, great points. And I think the other thing that's front of mind for me is just this whole concept of information overload. And I don't think that it's necessarily, anyone's fault. It's just the volume of information, just from a pure security perspective, is going to continue to grow. For example, organizations that are starting to move to the cloud, that presents a whole different context and nature of problems. The fact, we all know this, that we all carry devices that we own, that we now use for conducting our work. The fact that we connect from various different places. I mean, all of these types of things. Just if you go back to that security analyst, it's increasing the volume of information, the changes in context that they need to deal with. So from a controls perspective, it's figuring out how to find that needle in the haystack. What's the most important piece of information that I need to focus on? And then once I have that, very quickly be able to establish context around it. Okay, so I'm seeing that there's some attack behavior here. Now, quickly share with me, what does this mean? Where is it coming from? Have I seen this before? And being able to drill down very quickly to that context so that you can make a decision on what actions needed.
So, Bob, if I could follow up, what would you say are the advanced skills that you would put a premium on in today's marketplace, and frankly, where are organizations going to find them?
Well, for me, it's more than just an individual skill. I think there's an organizational skill as well, and that is, for example, putting solutions in place like Patrick and I have been sharing, where you can establish visibility into activity in your network and very quickly be able to zero in context to find out what's happening. So, for example, what Patrick and I have been sharing, that integrates with ArcSight. So for customers that are running HP ArcSight, they can get this context very, very quickly and understand and start to see, oh, I've got all kinds of login attempts that are happening against this server, and oh, by the way, that happens to be coming from an address that I've seen has had some malicious activity associated with it. That's going to change a process and a behavior versus I just see there's a whole bunch of activity against a server and under the assumption it may be somebody with bad login credentials, right? So it's establishing the visibility and the process given this new environment that we're in, so that if I just see a particular incident, it's not an incident unto itself, but I can understand that there's a bigger picture, grab that context very quickly, and then be able to make a decision on what needs to be done, as well as Patrick alluded to, then start to automate my systems so that instead of it having to be human and manual all the time, they can start to the systems can take corrective action given this information to help block further spread of the attack.
Patrick, I want to go back to the 6 steps you went through toward the end of your presentation. Where do you typically see organizations struggle, and how have you seen them overcome the challenges?
Yeah, I think the thing that most organizations are missing is being able to detect the lateral movement of attackers once they get in. Again, most organizations are focused on the point of entry and trying to keep everything out. That is important, but as they're finding, it's nearly impossible, right? The perimeter's gotten squishy. There's so many different entry points that it's just not possible to keep everything out of the organization. So then they need to look at, okay, assume that you are compromised. How do I detect that internal lateral movement to get the attacks mitigated and cleaned up as quickly as possible? A number of studies have shown that once organizations are infiltrated, I think the average number of days is something like 243 before the attack is discovered. And during all this time, they're moving around the network, identifying assets, and extracting data from the organization.
We've got time for a couple more questions here, but I do want to remind attendees, if you have questions for either Patrick or for Bob, do submit them now via the chat window on your screen. Those questions that we can't answer today, we will get responses back to you via email. Bob, I want to send this next question to you, and Patrick, I'd love your commentary as well. What message do I need to take to my board about advanced threats and solutions? And how can I put it in terms of they're going to get?
Well, for me, it's a couple of fairly straightforward and simple points. One, that the strategies, directions that they want to put in place for the organizations that they're representing, they now need to question and understand any assumptions as it relates to this attack environment. So, for example, if there is some intellectual property that they have that is unique and creates some differentiation, and they assume that there's a revenue stream associated with that, they need to ask themselves the question, how am I protecting that intellectual property so that a competitor or somebody else does not get their hands on it, especially given today's environment in terms of automated design processes, et cetera. So in other words, identify where, the analogy I used earlier, the key crown jewels are as it relates to the strategy that the boards are directing. Start to understand where the vulnerabilities are from an attack perspective as it relates to that data and what those impacts are, and start to put some funding, some process in place for that organization so that they can, if you will, fulfill their full fiduciary responsibilities so that the organizations can realize those strategies. Because without it, the chances of them being blindsided are, in my view, quite high.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, now we have the data. We see the actual cost. You can put a dollar amount on the effect of not securing your environment properly. So as Bob said, you identify these assets, you assign values to them, and then you determine, figure out what's the impact if I am breached, and what's the investment I need to make to ensure that doesn't happen.
Well, last question, Patrick. I'll toss it to you first, and Bob, give you the last word. If you could boil it down, what one thing must security leaders do differently in 2015 to help their organizations improve their abilities to detect and respond to targeted attacks?
I think the mindset change that I would take is you have to assume that you're breached. No longer is it just protecting the perimeter, but assume you're breached. Now, how do I find those breaches within the organization so that I can quickly react and mitigate them? It's a different mindset. It's a different set of tools. But you have to start thinking about it that way. Otherwise, you're going to continue to sort of have the blinders on, if you will.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, like any evolving problem, especially as it relates to security, my suggestion would be to ignore a lot of the hype and in my view, the oversimplification of the problem. And my suggestion would be to call and get a hold of your account representative from HP to sit down and have a discussion around what HP is offering with their Tipping Point Advanced Threat Appliance. As Patrick shared with you, it provides capabilities that are unique in the marketplace in terms of monitoring every corner of your network. It's all traffic, not just what's on the perimeter. It monitors more than just web or email traffic. It monitors over 80 protocols and applications, every network port, and all the other things that we talked about. Because, again, what may be happening today where the attackers are coming in the front door, these people are smart, they're intelligent, they know about these types of technologies that are there, and if the front door starts to catch the rats, so to speak, the rats are going to come in, your sump pump hole, your other windows, etc. And that's why you need this agnostic capability to monitor all the cracks and crevices, if you will, within your network to detect this type of attack behavior. And the big motivator behind that is it's all about your data and your crown jewels. You want to be able to protect those, stop attackers from being able to monetize that so that you can carry on with your business.
Bob, Patrick, very well said. I appreciate your time today, not just your presentations and your insights, but the time you spent to answer these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
And that does bring us to the end of the presentation. So I want to thank each of you, our attendees, for taking time out of your day to attend this webinar. I do trust that today's discussion provided valuable data points to enable you and your organization to be even better prepared to tackle the advanced threats we've discussed today.